If fuel stops tomorrow, how long can ADF operate? Not weeks. Not months. Think shorter.
That assumes a total cutoff, which is unlikely under current supply conditions.
I am not asking about cutoff. I am asking about delay. 2 weeks delay. What breaks first?
Some non-essential operations would slow, but core missions would still run.
Core missions depend on tempo, not just availability. F-35A needs sustained sortie rate, not parked capability.
True, but ADF has reserves and prioritization frameworks in place.
Reserves by time, not continuity. KC-30A extends range, but only if fuel keeps flowing.
Yes, but supply chains through Indo-Pacific are still functioning for now.
For now is doing a lot of work there. What if shipping slows, not stops?
That could become a problem if multiple routes tighten simultaneously.
This is not just Australia, this is regional pressure building.
The Indo-Pacific fuel network is tightly coupled, with Singapore, Japan, and Korea acting as major refining and redistribution hubs. Australia imports a large share of refined fuels through these nodes, especially aviation and diesel products critical for defense operations.
So if one node tightens, others feel it. Not isolated. Systemic.
Yes, but current flows are still moving, and governments are actively securing cargoes and prioritizing deliveries. Australia has already moved to support suppliers like Viva and Ampol to stabilize incoming shipments.
At higher cost, slower speed, higher risk. That changes behavior across the system.
It does, particularly with shipping insurance premiums rising in contested regions, which can delay or reroute tankers. This may not hold if multiple disruptions occur simultaneously across key maritime choke points.
Hormuz slows, insurance spikes, Asia refineries hold supply. What happens then?
In that scenario, regional states may prioritize domestic demand, reducing export volumes even without a full supply cutoff.
Including US allies.
Yes, alliance does not eliminate national prioritization under stress conditions.
Then Indo-Pacific coverage starts shrinking. Less fuel, fewer sorties, less presence.
Platforms like P-8A and KC-30A rely on sustained fuel access to maintain maritime surveillance and extended range operations. If supply tightens, operational tempo would likely be adjusted to preserve critical missions.
Adjusted means reduced.
Reduced, but not eliminated, at least in the early phase.
Early phase is the key phrase here. Because if this pattern continues, something deeper starts to show. You are assuming capability equals readiness, but those are not the same. How many F-35A can sustain daily sorties under constrained fuel flow?
On paper, Australia fields 72 F-35A, but sustained sortie generation depends heavily on fuel availability, maintenance cycles, and trained crew rotation. If fuel input tightens, sortie rates drop first, not fleet size, which creates an immediate gap between capability and actual availability.
So the fleet exists, but cannot fully operate at required tempo. That is a readiness illusion, not real deterrence.
It becomes a partial readiness condition, where high-value assets are preserved but overall operational tempo is reduced to maintain endurance. This gap becomes critical if sustained operations are required across multiple theaters simultaneously.
Then the constraint shifts from weapons to logistics throughput. KC-30A extends range, but only 7 exist in total.
Exactly, the KC-30A fleet is limited, and each aircraft carries around 100 tons of fuel, meaning tanker availability becomes a bottleneck under high demand. If tanker cycles slow due to fuel scarcity, the entire air combat network compresses inward geographically.
That directly impacts P8A coverage across northern approaches and sea lanes.
Yes, P8A missions rely on both onboard fuel and tanker support, and reduced availability limits maritime domain awareness significantly.
So awareness drops before combat power does. That breaks the kill chain early.
That assumption may not hold evenly, but under pressure, ISR degradation often precedes strike limitations in contested logistics environments.
Then this is not just reduced efficiency, this is structural fragility.
And if that fragility aligns across air, maritime, and logistics systems, it starts to resemble a systemic constraint rather than an isolated shortfall.
This is no longer a fuel issue, this is system stress. Multiple constraints aligning at the same time.
When fuel, logistics, and operational demand intersect, the system of systems begins to experience compounded pressure rather than isolated degradation. In a force like ADF, air, maritime, and ISR layers are tightly integrated through shared dependencies like fuel and tanker support.
So one bottleneck propagates across the entire kill chain. Not isolated. Cascading.
Yes, reduced tanker availability impacts F-35A reach, which then reduces strike options, while P-8A coverage shrinks maritime awareness simultaneously. This creates a feedback loop where less awareness increases risk, forcing more cautious and fuel-intensive operations.
That breaks deterrence posture without a single shot fired.
It weakens perceived presence, which is central to Indo-Pacific deterrence strategy, especially across northern approaches and sea lines.
And allies expect sustained contribution, not partial capability. What happens when Australia cannot maintain tempo?
Alliance structures like AUKUS and US integration assume interoperability and sustained operational output, not intermittent availability, under resource constraint. This risk compounds under pressure if partners also face regional supply tightening or prioritize domestic requirements.
So alliance becomes load sharing under stress, not reinforcement.
It could shift from reinforcement to burden distribution, where each node carries more risk as others stabilize internally.
Then deterrence becomes perception management, not real capacity. That is the twist.
The system appears resilient on paper, but in reality depends on continuous inputs that are vulnerable to disruption. And if those inputs falter across multiple domains at once, the entire defense posture begins to compress operationally.
Compression leads to fewer options. Fewer options means forced decisions under pressure.
And in a conflict scenario, that compression could translate into reduced response speed and limited escalation control.
Assume a crisis in northern approaches, fuel flow drops for 2 weeks. How fast does ADF actually respond under that constraint?
Initial response would still occur, but sustained operations would be limited as fuel allocation shifts toward highest priority missions only. F-35A sortie rates would likely be reduced to preserve reserves, while KC-30A tanker cycles slow due to constrained jet fuel availability.
So first contact happens, but follow-up weakens immediately. That creates a response gap, not total failure.
Yes, and that gap affects timing, meaning fewer aircraft on station and reduced persistence over contested areas like northern maritime corridors. P-8A patrols would also shorten duration or frequency, reducing ISR coverage and delaying detection within the kill chain.
Detection delay means decision delay, then response delay compounds.
Exactly, and in an A2AD environment, even small timing delays can reduce effectiveness of coordinated operations across air and maritime domains.
Now add alliance expectations into that scenario. US assets operating alongside ADF under pressure.
Interoperability remains intact, but contribution levels may drop, creating uneven burden sharing and potential coordination friction under time-critical conditions. This becomes critical if multiple task groups require support simultaneously, exceeding available tanker and fuel logistics capacity.
So Australia shows up, but cannot sustain presence at required tempo. That shifts perception immediately.
And perception of reduced persistence could influence adversary calculations, especially if response timelines extend beyond expected deterrence thresholds. Under those conditions, what begins as a temporary constraint could translate into a tangible operational disadvantage.
So this was never about running out of fuel completely. It was about losing tempo, losing control, losing options.
Yes, the constraint is not absolute depletion, but reduced operational continuity across interconnected systems like F-35A, KC-30A, and maritime ISR platforms. That reduction forces prioritization, which reshapes how deterrence is projected across the Indo-Pacific theater.
Then deterrence becomes conditional, not constant. And conditions can be influenced.
Exactly, and that introduces a vulnerability where external pressure on logistics can indirectly shape military posture without direct confrontation. This could reshape the balance if disruptions persist or align with broader regional tensions.
Not defeat, just delay.
And delay in a high-tempo environment can redefine escalation dynamics and alliance expectations in ways that are still evolving.
So the real question is not capability, but sustainability.
And if sustainability becomes uncertain, how stable is deterrence really?